People make a dangerous assumption when they lie to an empath. They assume empathy means gullibility. They assume kindness means blindness. They assume emotional depth somehow weakens perception. The truth is often the opposite. The very qualities that make an empath compassionate are often the same qualities that make them extraordinarily difficult to deceive. Because empaths are not just listening to language. They're observing patterns. They're reading emotional signals most people overlook. They notice the hesitation before a sentence, the forced smile that arrives a second too late, the shift in tone when certain names are mentioned, the contradiction between what someone says and what their nervous system appears to be communicating. And this is where many people misunderstand intuition. I think intuition is mystical, vague, irrational. But much of what we call intuition is actually pattern recognition operating beneath conscious awareness. An empath may not immediately say you're lying. In fact, often they won't. But they feel something distort, something doesn't align, and that inner signal stays alive even when they try to dismiss it. Psychologists have long understood that human communication is layered. Words carry one message. Behavior often carries another. Emotional congruence or incongruence reveals a third. Empaths are unusually sensitive to incongruence. They can sense when a person's words are trying to outrun their truth, and this creates a problem for the liar, because deception usually relies on managing appearances. It depends on controlling the surface. Empaths don't live only at the surface. They pay attention to what leaks through. A manipulative person may think they've hidden the truth because the story sounds convincing. The empath is noticing something else entirely. Why did your energy shift when that question came up? Why did your confidence become defensive? Why did your story become over-explained? Why does your apology sound rehearsed instead of felt? These are not random impressions. These are observations. And here's something even deeper. Empaths often understand pain, guilt, fear, and shame because they have studied those emotions in themselves. They recognize emotional signatures because they have lived them. That makes deception harder to disguise in front of someone who knows what internal conflict looks like. This is why people who lie to empaths often become frustrated. They feel seen in ways they didn't consent to, that their performance is not landing the way they expected. And sometimes they mistake this for judgment when really it is perception. Now, this does not mean empaths are never deceived. In fact, many empaths stay in deceptive dynamics far longer than they should, but not because they fail to sense dishonesty. Often because they sense it and then override themselves. They rationalize. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe they're just stressed. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe love means giving the benefit of the doubt one more time. And this is one of the great internal battles of the empath. Not detecting truth. Trusting what they detect. Many sensitive people have been conditioned to question their own perceptions, especially if they've dealt with gaslighting, manipulation, or environments where truth was constantly distorted. They may sense the lie immediately, then spend months trying to argue themselves out of what they already know. And this is where wisdom enters, because maturity for an empath is not becoming more suspicious, becoming more loyal to reality. It is realizing that if someone's words and behavior consistently conflict, the conflict is the truth. If someone repeatedly creates confusion, confusion is information. Something feels off over and over again. That feeling deserves investigation. This is not paranoia. This is discernment. And discernment is what turns empathy into power. Because empathy without discernment can be exploited. Empathy with discernment becomes nearly impossible to manipulate. And this is where people make their greatest mistake. They think because an empath stays quiet, they don't notice. An empath doesn't immediately confront. They don't understand. Because an empath gives grace, they must be unaware. Often the empath sees far more than they reveal. They may be watching. They may be waiting. They may be giving you space to tell the truth voluntarily, because empaths at their healthiest do not rush to accuse. They observe, They verify. They allow reality to expose itself, and reality always exposes itself. Lies have a structural weakness. They require maintenance. Truth sustains itself. Falsehood requires constant repair. And over time, most deception collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. The empath knows this, even if only intuitively. This is why many empaths appear calm in the presence of dishonesty. Not because they are fooled, but because they understand something profound. Truth does not need to panic. And there is something almost philosophical in this. A lie is not just false information. It is an attempt to impose an artificial reality. And empaths, by their nature, are oriented toward authenticity, toward what is real beneath performance, toward what is emotionally true beneath what is socially convenient. That is why lying to an empath is so destructive. Because you are not merely giving false facts. You are violating the very principle they organize human connection around, and they feel that deeply sometimes before you even finish speaking. So when someone lies to an empath, they often believe they are hiding something. But what they may actually be doing is revealing themselves, revealing their fear, revealing their integrity, revealing the fracture between appearance and character. And eventually the empath sees that fracture clearly. Not because they are psychic, because they are paying attention. That is the power people underestimate. The empath is not reading minds. They are reading patterns. And patterns rarely lie. So if you think deception protects you from being seen, understand this. You may hide facts for a moment. You may delay consequences for a season. You cannot consistently fake alignment in front of someone trained by life to notice what does not align. And that is why lying to an empath is never as invisible as you think. The first person deception exposes is often the deceiver. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. When words and energy conflict believe the pattern, truth whispers long before it proves itself. And once deception is sensed, something even more profound begins to unfold. Because with an empath, a lie is rarely interpreted as just a false statement. It is experienced as a fracture in the emotional architecture of trust. And most people underestimate what trust actually is. They treat trust like a casual social agreement, a convenience, a default setting in relationships. But to an empath, trust is something much deeper. Psychological safety. It is the invisible structure that allows vulnerability to exist. It is the unspoken contract that says what is real between us can be honored. And when that contract is broken through deception, the damage is rarely about the content of the lie alone. It is about what the lie means. Because when someone lies to an empath, the wound is not simply you gave me false information. The wound is you made me build emotional reality around something unreal. And that is betrayal. Betrayal is not disagreement. It is not conflict. It is not even necessarily wrongdoing. Betrayal is the collapse of trusted reality. And that hits an empath differently because empaths do not connect superficially. They invest through meaning, through emotional coherence, through felt honesty. So when dishonesty enters that bond, not stay at the surface. It echoes through everything the relationship was built on. Suddenly, the empath is not only questioning the lie, they are questioning every moment surrounding it. Was that apology sincere? That promise real? Were those words ever true? Was I loved honestly, or was I managed? And this is where one lie becomes psychologically larger than the event itself. Because deception does something dangerous to the mind. It forces retrospective doubt. It causes the past to become unstable. And when the past becomes unstable, the nervous system does not interpret that as minor disappointment. It interprets it as threat. Why betrayal often feels traumatic, because in many cases it is. The brain processes relational betrayal in ways remarkably similar to other forms of emotional injury. There is hypervigilance, rumination, looping, difficulty trusting perception. And for an empath, someone already sensitive to emotional undercurrents, this can cut extraordinarily deep, because what they gave was not casual trust. It was sincere trust. Sincerity, when violated, often becomes pain. Now here is where many people misjudge the empath completely. They assume the empath is hurt because they are overly emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too idealistic. That interpretation misses the entire point. The empath is hurt because they took truth seriously, because they believed honesty mattered, because they engaged the relationship as something sacred enough to deserve integrity. And that is not weakness. That is moral seriousness. In fact, one can argue that what makes betrayal painful is precisely what makes trust meaningful. If trust can be broken without consequence, then it never meant much to begin with. And empaths know this instinctively. That is why even so-called small lies often carry enormous weight. Because an empath is rarely measuring the size of the lie. They are measuring what it reveals about character. And this is a distinction many people never understand until it is too late. You think the problem was the hidden message. But the real problem was what hiding it communicated. That you chose control over honesty, image over intimacy, protection of self over protection of truth. And that changes how the empath sees you, maybe permanently. Because once deception reveals itself, something shifts. The empath may still care, may still love, may still try to understand, but innocence begins to disappear. And innocence once gone is very hard to restore. This is why repeated lying creates such devastating consequences with empaths. Not because they become angry in dramatic ways, but because they begin withdrawing trust at the level where relationships actually live. And when trust withdraws, connection becomes performance. Conversations become cautious. Vulnerability becomes restricted. Presence becomes guarded. The relationship may appear intact externally, while internally it has already begun collapsing. And often the liar does not even recognize this is happening because they think betrayal is only visible when someone leaves. Often betrayal becomes visible long before departure. It appears in emotional distance, in silence, in reduced disclosure, in the slow closing of access, because an empath, once wounded enough, does not always explode. Sometimes they simply stop opening doors, and that may be the greater consequence because anger can still be relational. Anger still engages. Silence born from broken trust is something else entirely. A disengagement, and that is much harder to repair. Now, there is a philosophical truth here worth considering. Every lie attempts to control perception, but every act of trust is an offering of reality. And when you betray trust, you are not just distorting perception. You are dishonoring an offering. That is why betrayal carries moral weight. It violates something human beings require to flourish together. And empaths, perhaps more than most, feel this at a profound level because they do not merely seek connection. They seek congruence. And deception destroys congruence. This is why lying to an empath often produces a consequence the liar never intended. It does not just expose dishonesty. It teaches the empath where not to place their heart again. And once someone learns that lesson, access changes forever sometimes. So if someone trusts you deeply, if they have given you honesty, emotional safety, vulnerability, understand the responsibility inside that, do not treat their trust as something resilient enough to survive repeated fractures, because trust is not usually destroyed in one dramatic moment. It erodes through accumulated violations, and what erodes slowly often disappears silently. And silence can be the final evidence that betrayal has already done its work. Why lying to an empath is such a profound mistake. Because what you think is a hidden act may become the very thing that reveals you as unsafe. And once a person sees you as unsafe, persuasion rarely restores what integrity could have preserved. Because trust is not repaired through explanation. It is repaired through truth, consistently, patiently, repeatedly. And many people only understand the value of honesty after they have lost someone who honored it. But by then, the lesson has become consequence. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. A lie does not only break facts, it breaks the reality two people were trying to build. And once reality fractures, rebuilding it costs far more than telling the truth ever would. And after betrayal has been recognized, after the patterns have become undeniable, after trust has been fractured, after the empath has wrestled internally with doubt, forgiveness, rationalization, and painful clarity, something changes. Not dramatically at first, quietly, almost invisibly. And this is where people who have underestimated an empath often make their greatest miscalculation. They assume the empath will keep explaining, keep confronting, keep giving more chances. They keep returning to the table to negotiate what should have never required negotiation in the first place. But there comes a point where awareness hardens into decision. And when that happens, the empath silence becomes one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Because silence in this context is not passive. It is not confusion. It is not surrender. It is resolution. There is a profound psychological shift inside that moment. Before this point, the empath may have spent enormous energy trying to preserve connection, trying to understand the other person's motives, trying to repair what honesty could have prevented, trying to save the relationship through communication. And this is important to understand. Empaths often do not leave at the first sign of betrayal. They far longer than most realize. Not because they are weak, because they believe in restoration, because they tend to see wounds beneath harmful behavior. They often interpret brokenness before they interpret malice, and because they do not give up easily on what they love. But endurance has limits. And once those limits are reached, the same person who once fought hardest for the connection may become the one who walks away most decisively. This is the part many manipulators never anticipate because they have mistaken patience for dependency, compassion for tolerance, understanding for permission, and those are dangerous misreadings because what looked like endless accommodation was often measured grace. And grace, once exhausted, does not always announce its departure. Sometimes it becomes silence. And silence is powerful because it signals something fundamental. The empath is no longer trying to convince you to become honest. They have accepted what you have revealed, and acceptance changes behavior. There is no more arguing, because arguing assumes the other person is open to truth. There is no more over-explaining, because over-explaining often arises when someone still hopes misunderstanding is the problem. There is no more emotional pursuit, because pursuit ends when reality becomes clear. And suddenly the energy that once went outward toward fixing, saving, understanding turns inward, toward boundaries, toward dignity, toward self-respect. This is where silence stops being absence and becomes authority, because the empath is no longer reacting to deception. They are responding to truth, and truth has simplified everything. Now, psychologically, this is a fascinating shift because manipulators often rely on emotional engagement. Conflict feeds them. Defensiveness feeds them. Repeated explanations feed them. Your need for closure feeds them. Silence withdraws participation. And when participation is withdrawn, the dynamic begins to collapse. Because many unhealthy relational patterns require your continued emotional involvement to survive. Silence breaks the mechanism, and that is why it feels so powerful. Not because silence is punishment, but because it is non-cooperation with distortion. It is refusal to keep negotiating with what has already been made clear. And there is something deeply philosophical in this. At some point, wisdom is knowing when further dialogue serves truth and when it merely prolongs confusion. That distinction changes lives. Many people believe strength is found in saying more, explaining better, making one final argument that finally forces the other person to understand. Often real strength appears when explanation ends because you stop needing your reality validated by someone committed to denying it, and that is freedom. This is the awakening many empaths eventually reach. I do not have to keep proving what I know. I do not have to beg honesty from someone choosing deception. I do not have to keep reopening wounds in search of closure from the source of injury. That realization is transformational because it moves the empath from emotional captivity to psychological sovereignty. And once that happens, their silence unsettles people because silence removes access. It removes emotional leverage. It removes the familiar script the other person expected to keep playing. And suddenly, the person who assumed they held control realizes control depended on the empath continuing to engage. The empath has stopped participating, and that changes everything. Now, let's be clear. This is not silent treatment. This is not manipulation through withdrawal. This is not performative coldness, something far more mature. It is discerned disengagement. It is refusing to keep investing life force where integrity no longer exists. And there is dignity in that. There is intelligence in that. There is self-honor in that, because silence at its highest form is not about punishing another person. It is about no longer abandoning yourself. And for many empaths, that may be the greatest lesson of all, because so often they have been taught to prioritize harmony over truth, understanding over boundaries, compassion over self-protection, and silence becomes the moment those imbalances are corrected, the moment they stop confusing self-sacrifice with love, the moment